So at the moment, every single sound is being routed to this main output here, which means it's coming through my stereo track. If I go through every single sound and choose a separate output, I will now have these individual hits routed out. But one thing I have to do first is actually make the auxiliary tracks in a mixer. Useful Logic shortcut is press V and it will make the plugin interface disappear. You can always bring it back up just by pressing V again, so it kind of toggles it. And I press X for my mixer. So on this software track here, I have a little plus button at the bottom, and that tells me that it's a multi-output software instrument, which means that if I click on the plus button, it will make the auxiliary tracks for me. So I click it until I've made every single one that I require, and make sure I click into space here so I deselect these tracks, otherwise anything I do now will be affecting both these tracks. So now, let's have a listen. I've got all the sounds routed to these individual auxiliaries. I'm obviously peaking up here, which I don't want to do. So if I notice, when I was coming out of one stereo track, I was at minus 5.1, so these are all on unity gain, which is why I got this extra volume. So I'll bring this down to give me a little bit of headroom to play with. So now I've got these on individual tracks, I can apply EQ, effects, compression and everything separately without having to process the whole beat as one. So, seeing as I've been so good so far and so organised, I'm going to carry on and name these tracks. Okay, cool. So now I've got them all to separate tracks and I've also got them all named. So what I'm going to do now is, I'm going to show you a little bit of a trick for producing a really punchy kick and open hat sound together. The way I'm going to achieve that punchy open hat and kick is by using a sidechained noise gate triggered by the kick drum on the open hat. So let me show you how I do that. So on the kick drum, we'll make a bus 1, and by alt clicking I can send unity gain to that bus. So make sure I mute the bus because I don't want to hear the actual output of that bus. So then on the open hat I place a noise gate down here. Then I want to set the noise gate quite high so that I can't hear the open hat unless the kick drum plays. Perfect. And I come up to the sidechain input and choose bus 1. And now the open hat is being triggered by the kick drum. So bypass it. You can hear that suddenly the open hat punches with the kick drum and they kind of follow the same kind of volume envelope. You can use this hold control to choose how much of the decay of the open hat I can hear. Nice. So now I've got that punching open hat and kick drum together. Let's have a look at EQing some of these hits. Now as I've got them all on separate channels in this multi-output mode, that means that I can apply reverb to the hits in different amounts, I can add different types of EQ, etc. So that's really a good thing to have that separation. So let's start off with the snare drum. So the idea of mixing is to be able to separate out the tracks so they all have their own little space in the frequency range and all kind of fulfill their own role in the track. And one thing that's important to do with that is to try and strip away the frequencies that aren't required in each sound. By doing that, it means you have more available volume for your master at the end. So let's take this snare drum for example. I'll switch on the analyzer. Now analyzers I use on every single track. I always want to see what's going on in the frequency range. And they can be great, especially if maybe you have a poor monitoring environment and you can compensate for that by actually seeing what's going on. One important thing to note is that the ears are always the most important judge though, and always have final say. So don't always kind of trust the analyzer. It's always your ears to judge. If it sounds good, then it is good. But the analyzer at the same time is really, really useful. So we'll switch it on and I'll choose this high resolution mode. so it'll accurately show me the frequencies that are present. Press play, and I can hear and see what's in my snare drum. So we're going to have a big sub bass part playing in this track, which is going to be operating about a 50-60 hertz mark. So what I could probably do is roll off the snare from about 60 hertz. I probably won't need those frequencies in there, which means I'm going to be saving volume. What I'm also going to look at is any of these little resonant peaks that stick out of the frequencies that are in the sound. Those are all going to add up at the end and affect my final limiting and compression. So the more of these little peaks we have in there, the more the track's going to be turned down. So what I like to do is try and kind of even out the waveform that's present in the sound, so I don't have any of these nasty little spikes in there. So I'll show you how to do that. What you can do is actually increase the size of the EQ. Sometimes it can help you see a little bit what you're doing. So make a very narrow bell shape in the EQ, and then try and hone on the frequency. I'm going to choose this little spike out here. Now it's gone. So a lot of time you can't even hear any difference in that waveform, but if you do that on every single sound, that all adds up to volume being taken away, which means the whole track can be louder at the end. It can be really hard to kind of hone on the exact frequency you're looking for, but you get there in the end. So it's important to switch off the analyzer when you've finished, because otherwise these analyzers will all use up CPU, even if the EQ's not actually open. So I'll switch that off. So I'm going to move on to closed hi-hat, because I know it's going to be a good example because there's quite a lot of audio junk in there. And then we won't waste time with me doing every single sound. We'll move on to some compression and bus processing. So double click to open it up. We can see here, look at this. This is sub bass frequencies. Some of these I probably can't even hear because they're so low. They're not required in a closed hi-hat sound. The closed hi-hat sound is going to be producing energy in the upper frequency range. I don't need this stuff down here. So with the low cut, slight difference, but it's very marginal. I've saved all that volume to have the track loud at the end. Good to use these little buttons here to switch EQ bells or cuts on and off, so you can hear what the difference is. Just slightly smoothen out that closed hi-hat sound. I actually prefer the sound of it now, so I'll leave that on. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that on the other sounds, and then we'll look at some compression and bus processing. Okay, so I've just EQ'd the remainder of the sounds, kind of a lot of low cut going on, and also tamed some of the little peaks in there. So I've got a kind of cleaner sound now without a lot of those low frequencies muddying things up. So now we're going to have a little look at routing the drums in Logic, also applying some bus processing and some parallel processing to the drums, and also we're going to add some reverb as well. So first of all, I'm going to drag these channels at the bottom here and select them, and I'm going to choose bus 2 now. I'm going to call that drum bus. It's important to name them because then they'll actually show up in the list with the name. While I'm at it, I'm just going to name my kick sidechain as well. Okay, so now we've got all the drums routed to this drum bus here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add a compressor on there, Logic compressor. I'm going to do it in AR mode, which I believe is based on a Neve compressor. So I basically like to apply gentle compression to the drum bus because all the drum hits have been compressed anyway when they were created. So really we're just trying to gel the sounds together rather than do anything too drastic. But first of all I'm going to alt click on here just to bring this back to unity gain. And then let's bring in some compression. So the threshold and ratio are the two controls that allow me to dial in the amount of compression I want. So the lower the threshold and the higher the ratio, the more compression we're going to be applying. I've got about 2 decibels of gain reduction there. Can try a bit more. As I said, personally I like to not overdo it on the drum bus compression. We don't want to have the attack too fast, otherwise we'll chop away the transients of the drums. And we don't want to have the release too slow, otherwise the compressor won't recover in between the drum hits. Okay, close that down. So next thing we're going to do is set up some parallel compression. What that means is we run a second compressor alongside our bus compression on ascend, and we can then dial in that parallel compressed drum sound alongside our original drum sound. So click on bus 3 and name that parallel compression. And I'm going to make this pre-fader. We set that to pre-fader so we can balance the drum bus and the parallel compression bus separately. I'm going to make that unity gain. I'm just going to turn down the level here because it's going to come through quite loud. Go back to the compressor again. Unity gain on here too. And I'm going to apply this VCA mode, very responsive and fast, good for the parallel compression bus. So what I want to do is I'll play the track. I want to smash this one. Fast attack, fast release, high ratio, low threshold. We want about 12 dB of gain reduction. So it's really, really grungy and kind of distorted and over compressed. We want that as our main drum sound, but dialed in alongside our drum bus, it adds a bit of kind of body and grit to it. Let's try it without. So it really helps bring out a lot of the kind of quieter elements of the drum sound, like the ride cymbal and some of the hats. Okay, I'm now going to just take both these buses and route them to bus 4, and I'm going to call that drums final. I now have an independent fader which I can use to control the level of both the drum bus and the parallel compression bus, and they'll keep their relative balance as well. Okay, so just another thing on the drum bus, sometimes it's good to apply a limiter as well at the end of the drum bus just to catch any little spikes that come through. So we use the gain and the output level as our balance. Now we're just limiting it slightly when the snare plays and the kick. So it's quite nice to have that on the end of the drum bus as well sometimes. Okay, so next thing I'm going to do is look at some reverb. Now I'm going to go through this quite quickly. because we could spend a while choosing the different reverb settings, but we don't really have a while in this video. So I'm going to use some settings that I've used before on tracks. So I'll make bus 5 the reverb bus, choose a reverb here, and I'm going to add in a small space, room, hard studio for my snare. Just adds a little bit of space to that snare. I'll add the same for the clap. Just name my bus as well. I'm also going to select these rides and hats multiply and just add in a bit for all of them. Generally not a very good idea to add reverb to the kick drum because it can really kind of muddy the mix. If you feel like you want to, then you can try adding a separate reverb and maybe applying a low cut afterwards so it doesn't muddy it too much. I'm going to add another bit medium reverb for the snare. Quite useful, you can try different settings quickly by using this little button here. I'm also going to apply some medium reverb to the ride because that's going to be quite a background sound really, so it'd be quite nice to have a bit more space on it. Okay, cool. So, just quickly I'm going to do some panning as well on these sounds. Just getting a little balance between the closed hat and the open hat there. And we don't want to go too far with the panning because obviously if you listen to the track through a sound system which is in stereo, if you have too much difference between the left and right hand side, that can be a bit of a problem. So don't go overboard with the panning, but it's good to have a little bit of panning just to add some separation to some of the elements in the track. Just a little word on these reverbs and setting up the reverbs. You notice that I did it on sends, on buses rather than placing them on inserts on the channel. And the reason for that is the space designer in Logic and good quality reverbs in general are very CPU intensive, so the more reverbs you have, the more you're going to be draining your resources. And also if you have every single sound playing in a different space, that's not very good for the overall kind of unity of the mix because it's going to sound like the elements are all playing in different spaces rather than one kind of unified space. By that I'm not suggesting you just use one reverb. Sometimes you might have up to 5 or 6 reverbs in the track for special effects and stuff like that, but it's maybe good to have like 2 or 3 core reverbs that most of the sounds use for space, just so you have that kind of unified sound. Okay, so now we've got the sounds routed separate outputs. We've applied EQ, we've done some low cutting, and we've tamed some of the peaks. We've also selected those tracks and routed them to a drum bus where we've applied some gentle compression and some limiting. We've also set up a parallel compression channel, and we've added some reverb at the end. So I'm going to just go away and add some melodic elements to this track, and when we come back I'm going to have a look at tuning the kick drum to the bass and also some other sidechain effects.